No, I think that's an important question, and it surprised me as well as lots of other people by the way the Russians went into Ukraine. Their initial operation was very different from what anybody anticipated. And I think President Putin went in with the following objectives. Remember, he's been talking for at least 15 years about his opposition to the movement of NATO to his borders. He's made it very clear that he regarded it as a threat. One of the reasons he moved into Crimea was that he saw that becoming a NATO naval base, principally for the U.S. Navy, obviously in the Black Sea. So he moved on that first and then said, look, it's got to stop. Well, what happened, of course, as you know, is we had the coup in Kiev, or now the Ukrainians call it Kyiv. And as a result, we installed a government that was prepared to do essentially whatever we wanted them to do. And we poured billions of dollars in very early to build up an enormous Ukrainian military force whose sole objective was to attack Russia. And it wasn't very long before Putin concluded that if I don't act soon, I'll have missiles sitting on my border that will be able to reach my nuclear deterrent in no time and rob Russia of any sort of security at all. So he decides to go in, but I think he thought at the beginning, and this was a false assumption, that he would have someone to negotiate with. So he said, I'm going to go in really initially with only about 90,000 troops, organized into small contingents. He gave strict orders that they were to avoid collateral damage at all costs, didn't want to kill anybody. He knew he was moving into an area which was largely Russian anyway. But he also didn't want to kill Ukrainian forces at that point. He said, I want to demilitarize the place, but he said, I don't want unnecessary casualties on the Ukrainian side. And remember, from his vantage point, these were also Slavic cousins, brothers, whatever you want to call them. And the Russians felt that way, I think, initially. And so he moves in with this very small force. He encounters a lot of resistance. I think the resistance is exaggerated in the sense that the Russians have never taken heavy casualties. But nevertheless, he encountered a great deal of resistance. But most important, when he met with people for negotiations, he discovered there's no willingness to reach an agreement because Washington principally is in charge. Washington doesn't want an agreement. I mean, he can read the tea leaves, and the tea leaves are very clear. This is Washington's opportunity to, quote unquote, bleed Russia. In addition to bleeding Russia, once we've bled it, we're going to see Putin and his regime removed. And ultimately, then we'll think about what we want to do with Russia, to include stripping it of resources, breaking it up into smaller parts, whatever. This, of course, was a horror story that he had not really believed in. And he found out, gee, I was wrong. And so by the summer, he has a meeting with all the senior officers, and they say, look, we wanted to go in hard. You told us to go in soft. We wanted more troops. You said no. Now we're in the middle of something. We're not going to end this conclusively unless we build a larger and more decisive force with the right capabilities. And so you have this change in strategy. It says we will consolidate control over what we've got, which is about 20 to 22% of the territory where most of the Russians, but not all of them, lived, where most of the resources are too, by the way. And we will run essentially an economy of force mission. Our strategy is to build an impregnable fort and then let the Ukrainians expend themselves against it. And then when we're ready, we'll take the offensive. And that's effectively what's happened. And the Ukrainians have expended themselves. They're now at a point where I would say there's practically nothing left. Anybody who was really trained to do much is dead or wounded. It depends on which source you want to trust, but it runs from 250,000 dead up to 300,000 dead to 350,000 dead on the Ukrainian side.
And that's military force, not...
Yeah, that's just soldiers. That's just soldiers. Now, I don't know how many civilians have been killed, and I'm very, very suspicious of that because despite the change in strategy that resulted, he has always been unwilling to kill, quote unquote, innocents. So if he strikes something, or you see
President Putin.
Yeah. So if you see a strike going somewhere, as we did quite recently, the objective was to kill, frankly speaking, foreign forces that were billeted in a hotel. This included U.S., U.K., and others, because he's been warning everybody in NATO, get out. If you don't get out, you're going to be at risk. And then, of course, next to it, I guess, was a school or something. And so immediately the Ukrainians say, see, the Russians are killing people in schools. You know, we went through this repeatedly where the Ukrainians would set up gun positions inside hospitals, schools, malls. And once that happened, the Russians had no choice but to destroy those gun positions, which meant that they were inevitably attacking what were formerly only civilian targets. I mean, this is not new. We've been through this in the Middle East. We've experienced something similar. So the bottom line is that now we're at a point where the Ukrainians really have expended virtually everything they've got. They're now talking about mounting one last counteroffensive. I don't know how they're going to do it. Whatever they do, it won't succeed. They have no chance of breaking through Russian defenses. In the meantime, I think we've had a certain amount of unrest in the senior ranks of the Russian military because a lot of the senior officers want to attack and end this war. And they're very concerned about
a lot of what senior officials?
General officers in the Russian army, the senior generals.
So then there's a misalignment between Putin and his leaders.
Well, I don't know if I'd call it a misalignment as much as Putin is still reluctant to take decisive action to end the war quickly because he's concerned about our predisposition to intervene. The great fear from the beginning has always been that once it became clear that the Ukrainian position was hopeless, there would be pressure in Washington to intervene, to rescue what's left.
We almost have to protect our $150 billion investment. Right? It's almost if you think about it, it's like hedging. If that does happen, hey, we're so in it now that we said once we're not going to send them tanks. If we do, it's going to be this. Now we're talking, planes and all this stuff. We almost have to defend Ukraine now.
Well, I don't think so, but
I'm talking from the Biden's administration.
Yeah, well, your argument actually probably sounds more like how we got ourselves into the First World War. But the bottom line is with this crowd right now, they've expended enormous sums of money. So I'm sure there's pressure from BlackRock and Raytheon and others. Somebody told me the other day there are only 3 branches of government in the United States now. One is BlackRock, one is Raytheon, and the other is the pharmaceuticals. So there's some tragic truth to that, since the Hill is basically owned by donors and we have government by donors. The American people really don't have much of a voice, and they don't know much about it, so they don't say much about it. But the truth is, right now the Ukrainians are on the ropes. There's no doubt about it, and there's this discussion, I think, behind the scenes. Do we just move now and end this thing decisively because they can? Or do we wait some more and let the Ukrainians expend some more time and effort? And now you have discussions in the West about a joint Polish-Lithuanian intervention into Western Ukraine. And that's exactly the sort of thing that the Russians have been concerned about. And that could never happen without us authorizing it, supporting it, and encouraging it. And Putin knows that. So we're at a kind of crossroads right now in terms of what's next, and the Russians have to make a decision.
Well, there's a lot there. I'm sorry, Tom. There's a lot there that we covered. A few things. So from a strategist standpoint, okay, the world, when they think about who Putin is, former KGB, this guy's going to be a shrewd guy. He's going to be 15 steps ahead, or he's going to identify his next 5, 10, 15 moves. So you're going to sit there and say, if we do this, that guy's going to do this. If we do this, are we going to push NATO to want to move quicker to support them? If we do this, maybe it's going to be easier to take over a part of Ukraine that we want under Biden, not Trump, because it's going to... I'm picturing him as a guy that sat there with his generals looking at every single possibility that could happen. How did he miss the ball on, hey, let's go soft on this. It's going to be fine. They're going to cave in. We're going to get him in no time. His military guys say, no, let's go hard. That's a big miscalculation there on his end, isn't it?
Well, I think President Putin, you mentioned his KGB background. One of the things that people do not understand about the KGB is that the individuals that served in it were practically the only people in the Soviet Union that were allowed to travel beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. That meant that they could travel in the West. Putin was very familiar with the West, particularly with Germany. And by the way, he likes Germans, speaks pretty good German, because I've listened to him in his interviews. So from his standpoint, he saw a West that he thought they could work with, they could deal with. And he's always been criticized inside Russia for taking that position, because I would say the mainstream Russian position is you can't do business with the West. The West is our implacable enemy. That will never change. We are Russians. We are not part of Europe. We are not part of the West. I think Putin took a different position. I think he thought that Russia should be part of the larger European concert and should have a role in the West. Well, it turns out his critics were right and he was wrong. Now, he's still a very popular leader because he has improved the standards of living, prosperity. He's restored a lot of Russian national pride and dignity. I think his latest poll, unofficial poll that we get out of Russia, puts him at about 89% approval, whereas Biden is at about 30%. So I think Putin is very secure in that sense now, but he has always struggled with this idea of how far do I want to push it, because Putin is a smart man. He says, when this is over, we want to live with the Europeans and we want to live with the United States. We never thought about that during the Second World War. There were some people who did, because we did enormous damage to Japan, enormous damage to Germany, which is one of the reasons we had to stay there for 50 years. And there were a few voices. Admiral Leahy, who was effectively the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time for Roosevelt, brought in the generals and said, look, you're doing terrible things to these people. We want to be able to live with the Germans and the Japanese when this is over. Well, we didn't pay too much attention to that, but Putin is taking a different position. And he has also made it very clear that this is Russia. This is not the Soviet Union. And the Russian military, contrary to what the Ukrainians have been claiming, have not committed atrocities all over the place. They've not murdered and raped and pillaged. In other words, this is not Stalin's force, his slave army of 1944 and 45. Putin's made that very clear. He still wants to get along, quote unquote. He wants to avoid a direct war with the United States and with NATO. That drives much of his behavior. But as I said, now he's at a point where he's got to make some decisions. And that is, what do we do? Do we continue to move slowly and deliberately and watch as the Poles and Lithuanians, presumably backed by the United States, intervene in Western Ukraine? Is that what we do? Or do we act? Because what he doesn't want is whatever remains of Ukraine when this is over, he wants that to be neutral. He doesn't want it to be militarized. He doesn't want it to be a platform for attack against Russia. He views Ukraine the same way we viewed Cuba in 1963. We don't want it to be a platform for attack against us. We still don't. And that's his position. Now, can he achieve that if he stands by and allows the Poles, the Lithuanians, or anybody else, even U.S. forces, to move into Western Ukraine? I think the answer is no.
Colonel, is the position you just described very eloquently on President Putin, is that the resolved view that is in front of President Biden? Is that where the Joint Chiefs are, or are they taking a different view?
What I do know is that the senior officers in the Army and the Pentagon, I can't speak for the other services, but certainly the Army, have made it very clear that we are in no position to wage conventional war against the Russians.
And are they presenting what you just presented as Putin's attitude and position with that?
I doubt it, simply because if you try to present that position to the people who are really running the government, they are so full of hatred and animosity and antipathy for Moscow and what it represents to them that no one will listen. So I think they have what we call ideological blinders on.
So is that why there is so much willingness, if that is a prevailing view that's being propagated not only to the president's daily, threat report, I assume, and to the president himself, then is it any surprise to you that senators are greenlighting billions of dollars for Ukraine? Because it's to defeat this evil, not to go Middle East on you, but to defeat this evil Satan that is the old USSR, Russia.
Well, remember, part of the problem here is of Putin's own making. At the beginning, because of the way he went in, it conveyed to the West this notion that, see, the Russians aren't serious. They're weak. They're weak. They don't know what they're doing. And then we flooded the airways with all of this propaganda about the Russians are stupid. And they described the Russians exactly the way the Germans described the Soviets during World War II, which, of course, was nonsense. I mean, I was in graduate school in Soviet East European studies, so I'm very familiar with it. And they literally lifted phrases and things out of books that had been written about the Soviet army in the end of the Second World War, and they were hurling this crap at the Russians. And everybody in the West, of course, was eager to believe it. Remember, we have the Cold War behind us. So it's not very hard to say, the Russians are really bad. Sure. Oh, yeah, right. They were bad a few years ago, so they must be bad again. That's part of the problem. But Putin went in. He was too easy, and it looked as though he was weak. Well, now everything has turned around. You've got about 750,000 troops focused on the Western military district in Russia, in other words, the Western theater. About 350,000 in the south. Now, where are the other 400,000? Well, some of them are tied up in logistical support infrastructure. Some of them are in missile, rocket, artillery batteries. Some of them are up in Belarusia. Some of them are just in Western Russia. The point is that this is an enormously powerful force now with all the most modern equipment and technology. I think even the biggest skeptics are shocked and surprised at the precision, the accuracy, and the responsiveness of Russian missile and strike assets.
For people who are listening who don't have a map in front of them, when you say the Western theater of Russia, you mean the eastern also border of Ukraine, right there, and
Yes.
the south you mean Crimea.
I'm talking about in southern Ukraine, the area which is referred to by the Russians as Novorossiya. This stretches from basically Odessa all the way up to Kharkov. Most of that is now under Russian control.
With this force of three-quarters of a million.
Yes.
So okay, so let's go back to trying to think what Putin was thinking about. So let's go soft instead of going hard. What's the advantages of going soft? So for you as a strategist, to be fair, I mean, you know, when you're saying, you know, how you would do it and what you would do, you have a PhD, I think, in international relations from University of Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. So if what is the advantage of going soft? Are you going soft because you're thinking that guy's going to cave? Okay, fine. So let's flip it. What is the advantage of going hard right off the bat, where his soldiers are saying, no, we have to go strong with these guys to get what done? What's their argument of going hard instead of going soft?
Well, first, let's be clear about PhDs and degrees. You know, thermometers have degrees, and you know where you stick those. I'm not disparaging my PhD. I'm just being honest. There are a lot of people walking around with degrees that don't know anything. In fact, I would argue that most of them don't amount to anything. They don't produce anything. They're not practitioners. I focused when I went to graduate school in military matters because I'm a professional soldier. And it was my obligation, I thought, since the American people were funding my education, to focus on military affairs, and specifically at that point on the Soviet Union and to a lesser extent East Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia. Those are the areas where I focused. Now, having said that, again, it goes back to a set of assumptions. I think that Putin, if you go back and look at his willingness to negotiate, there was a point during the first 3 weeks when the negotiators met that Putin said, I will immediately embrace a ceasefire while these negotiations are on. And they stopped. The Russians stopped in their tracks. Of course, people in the West said, well, that's because they're logistically unsustainable and all this. But that wasn't true. He was sending a signal. I'm serious. I'm willing to negotiate. And remember that the whole thing revolved around the Minsk Accords. Nobody in the West pays much attention to those accords, but they were signed by Germany, France. We backed them. And we promised that the Russians who live in Ukraine would be treated as equal citizens, equal before the law along with Ukrainians. They would not be pressured to become Ukrainian as long as they were good citizens and obeyed the law. They could speak their own language, go to their own schools, go to their own church, and so forth. That was a big lie, as it turns out. And Angela Merkel, who was the German chancellor, was the first to come out publicly and say we lied. That was just to buy time for Ukraine to build itself up into the military power that it has become. Subsequently, Macron admitted it was a lie. So even after having been lied to prolifically about all the things that were important to the Russians, he decided, I'll call a ceasefire. We'll see how these talks progress. Well, the talks didn't progress. And then suddenly we had this man, Boris Johnson, who flew in as effectively a surrogate for Biden and said, stop, don't give up anything. And that was because Zelensky had said, sure, I think we could live with neutrality. Actually made that statement, which was the end goal as far as Putin was concerned. We wanted to be neutral. In other words, you have this nice, large, neutral state the size of Texas that lies between Russia and NATO. Gosh, that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. In fact, back in 1999 and 1998, when I was the director of the Joint Operations Center at SHAPE headquarters, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, these discussions went on, and somebody said, well, where's Ukraine in all of this? And everybody said Ukraine's mission is to be a nice buffer, Don't fight there. Don't go there. Let them be a nice buffer between Russia and us. I mean, that was widely viewed as a positive thing. Well, that was thrown out of the window. And instead, Boris Johnson says, we will back you to the hilt. We will give you everything that we possibly can. Your job is to go out there and fight, and we'll back you. And eventually, we will be victorious. The Russians will collapse. Putin will be gone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. None of that's happened. And today, Russia is stronger, I would argue, economically than it was before the war began. Our sanctions have been ultimately quite helpful to the Russians. They are not a part of our Western financial system to the extent that they might have been hurt by us seriously.
How have the sanctions been helpful to Russia?
Well, they've managed to sell all of their energy products, all of their minerals, everything, agricultural products through others at higher prices that have ultimately reached their target destination in Europe and other parts of the world anyhow. So the amount of hard currency, if you will, from the West that's pouring in has actually increased. At the same time, they've discovered that they could sell virtually everything if they needed to China and India to a lesser extent. Those two countries, these are over 1 billion people in each country, enormous economies. They want to do business with Russia. So the absence of the European market, per se, has not turned out to be this terrible experience that everyone in the West assumed it would be.
Wasn't that a chess game a lot of people saw coming, because both India and China will never be self-sufficient on energy?
Well, I suppose so. I don't know that anybody regarded it as a chess game, because the difference between Putin, whatever mistakes he made in terms of assumptions, shrink to insignificance next to the mistakes that we've made, I would argue, because we made assumptions about Russia that were just completely wrong, just like the rest of the world. Number one, Russia is a backward economy that will collapse quickly if we sanction it. In other words, that they're not a true nation state in the Western sense. They don't have a developed economy. They can't survive.
Yeah, we regarded it as some sort of mega island.
Yeah. They don't have a real scientific industrial base. Now suddenly we see all of these factories in Russia running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing ammunition, weapons, missiles, all these things we said they were going to run out of very, very quickly and couldn't replenish. We said that no one would support Russia, that Russia would be isolated. Well, in fact, I would argue that most of the world actually backs Russia against us, that we and the Europeans are increasingly on an island all by ourselves. And Russia is not going to fall apart. Russia has become more cohesive. This is a state that rests on the foundation of Orthodox Christianity and Russian ethnicity. Now, there are plenty of people inside Russia who are not ethnic Russians. Those people are treated very well. They are treated as equal partners inside Russia. All you have to do is look at the Chechens, and the Chechens are brilliant soldiers, by the way. I keep hearing people say, well, they're not really that good. Well, you could not be more wrong. Those people are superb, and they are fiercely loyal. And by the way, if you go back to the Tsarist period, every Tsarist army had contingents in it that were Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Chechens, others, Turkic peoples, Tartars, working with them and fighting with them against whomever the enemy was, whether it was the Ottomans or the Austrians or whomever. So the point is that Russia is more cohesive than we are. If you're looking for internal unrest, discontent, divisive forces, you can find those in spades inside American society. But that's not the case in Russia at all.
So when you look at the economy-wise, one may say, yeah, they're doing better today. But even prior to the war, they had a big birth and death problem. I don't know if you've seen the numbers on their birth and death rate. If you want to pull that up, that's not a good look. The closest thing you can compare that to as a case study, they're having more people dying than being born. There's only one other country you can compare this to, and you know who that is. It's one of their allies. It's China. Those guys have the similar issue. India is the complete opposite. And we're not doing that great ourselves, but Russia's not a good place when it comes down to that. But I want to go back to the thought.
Well, wait a minute before you leave.
Yeah.
Putin agrees with you.
Yeah.
And Putin has tried very, very hard to reverse that. First thing he tried to do is to prevent the brain drain. Everybody with any talent or ability had been getting out of Russia since 1992. So he's tried to reverse that. I think he's had some success. He's tried to encourage people to have
How, by the way, if you don't mind, how did he do the first one? I'm curious.
Basically by finding employment for scientists and engineers that otherwise had nowhere to go. He said, we've got to find employment for these people so that we can keep them here. We have to reward them for their talent. I think he's done reasonably well there. When it comes to the rest of the economy, turning around this attitude that why should I bring 2 or 3 children into a world that's dominated by alcoholic men that are destroying themselves and committing suicide has turned out to be pretty tough. I think he's made some progress there. I think this war is going to help him enormously because I think the war is awakening a sense of Russian identity that is far, far stronger and greater than anything we thought existed. All you have to do is talk to the people that are inside Russia and ask Russians what they think. Everybody says, well, they're all afraid of Putin, so they're not going to tell you the truth. That's not true. That's just not true. And we're hearing as exactly what I said. Russia is closer, united more today than I think it has been in at least 30 years or 40 years.
Okay. So then as a competitor, whoever you go up against, you're going to do better if you put them as being overly calculating, meaning it's naive to just say it's a simplistic war. Let's just do this. This is what's going to happen. We're going to be this, right? Okay. For me, sometimes you know how an enemy forces you to do something to come out and say, see, I told you this is what they wanted to do the entire time. So, for example, I want to get your feedback on this. So, NATO is trying to do whatever they can to get Ukraine to be part of NATO. No, that's not what we're trying to do. No, that's exactly what they're trying to do. And this is why they promised us they would never do this. And now they're going to be doing this. Nope, that's not what they're doing. So he's pushing. And then all of a sudden, the article comes off from Guardian. If you want to show that article real quick, I think it's Guardian. You know which one I'm talking about. NATO accelerating the membership.
Yep.
NATO allies back fast-track membership for Ukraine. Says cleverly, U.S. Foreign Secretary says Ukraine has evolved quickly as Zelensky tells summit it can be engine of green growth. So all of this time that they're talking about this is now leading to, we have to use this as an opportunity to bring him into NATO. Then Putin's going to come out and say, well, I told you guys this was the entire intention, this is why I'm doing X, Y, Z, because I knew you guys were doing this. Is he that calculating of a guy that he's forcing his opponent and his enemy to expose their hand? Or is it just accidentally that this happened because he didn't think the war was going to last this long?
I hesitate.
You know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I do. And I think the man's highly intelligent. And there is no doubt in my mind that he views what you just said as a welcome development, that his opponent is essentially revealing his hand, saying this is what we're really all about. But I do think at the beginning he still thought there was a degree of goodwill in the West that he could exploit. And there is none. That's what he's found out.
Unpack that.
I think because of his experience watching various administrations, remember he met with Bush, he subsequently met with Obama and ultimately with Trump. Each time he was trying to understand us, trying to understand what we were about. And I think he listened to what was said in private, and he convinced himself that these people really aren't the enemy. That they are unreasonably obsessed with or fascinated with NATO, which he doesn't see any reason for. I mean, quite frankly, since he had one of the things that's very funny is people say, well, he was going to invade Eastern Europe. Well, wait a minute. You told me back in March that his army was small and incapable, and now you're telling me he was always going to invade. I mean, which is it? It's a bunch of nonsense. So he wasn't going to invade. He wanted to do business with everybody badly because he knows that if Russia is to continue to develop and grow, he needs technology. Most of the technology that he wants is in Germany. So Germany is enormously important to Russia and always has been. Well, now he's turning away because he's trying to substitute Chinese, Indian, and other economic powers for German cooperation. But the bottom line is that I think Putin miscalculated up front. There was no goodwill. He thought there was. And now he knows it. So what are you going to do about it, Mr. Putin? And I think the Russians are all standing around saying, okay, we like you. You've done a great job. The army is ready. It's up and running. It's now large enough and strong enough to do what needs to be done. Mr. Putin, what are you going to do?
Yeah. And, makes sense. We're going to see how much of that was, wasn't expecting it. He was just kind of going in to do it. And then now all of a sudden the hands are being shown. But let's look at the other side. The other side is anytime it happens in sports, it happens in families, it happens in companies. Oh, look what's going on in Amazon. 6 of Jeff Bezos' C-suite executives all resigns on the same day. Hey, look at the Elon Musk today with Twitter. 1,250 employees resigned. That place is a civil war today, right? And they'll say things like this. And us as readers, we're not in it. We're like, oh, wow, shit's hitting the fan in,
right.
Twitter. Shit's hitting the fan in this place. If you look at it with Wagner Group, Wagner Group, or whatever they want to call themselves, these guys come out, and he's a billionaire himself. He's done well for himself. And, hey, our goal is to do this, and our goal is to do that. And then story comes out saying Putin disappears after Wagner coup, chaos, Daily Mail. Russian President Vladimir Putin has not been seen publicly since he addressed the nation regarding the Wagner Group failed putsch amidst rumors of Putin's flight to Tver region. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, wonderful guy, by the way, noted cracks emerging in the Russian administration. Putin, in a pre-recorded message, termed the Wagner troops move as a stab in the back of our troops around the people of Russia. What we are facing now is a treason. Okay. And then obviously talks about who Yevgeny is and what he's done, all this stuff, which I'd love for you to talk about that as well. When that happens from the outset, it's very easy for the enemy to say, look what's going on over there. Even his people don't support his decision. He's about to be replaced. It's about to be very quickly, like the last time this happened. We saw this 25 years ago when this took place. Within a week, somebody came in and took over Russia. And that's exactly what's going to be happening, right? Opposing message of how you said this thing's going to be done in Ukraine very quickly. The other side said, he's about to fall in the next week. Watch, this thing's going to happen very quickly. That's not a good look when that happens, where the leader of a country has to leave because they're worried about what's going to happen to him. So one, from the optic standpoint. Two, from he's got an 89% approval rating. If he does, why are people going against him? And there's clips of people supporting Yevgeny saying, hey, thank you for doing this. Optics matter.
Well, the people that were thanking Yevgeny Prigozhin were not thanking him for rising up in some sort of uprising. They were thanking him and the Wagner Group for their heroic performance on behalf of the Russian people. And those same people that were doing that also said, we love Putin. We love our president. I think people, first of all, made a mistake of assuming that what was happening was an uprising. It never was. And Prigozhin made that very clear. We'll learn more in the future. But what we know at this point is the following. First of all, Putin didn't flee anywhere. Putin wasn't afraid of anything. He has 30,000 troops. He did take 10,000 in the Ministry of Interior Forces. These are very, very heavily armed police, and moved them into various areas because they had intelligence already on many Ukrainian terrorist cells. They simply went out there and eliminated all of these. That was simply a case of let's go do it, get it over with, in the event that there's something going on between them and this group in the Wagner Group. It turns out that Putin did talk directly to Prigozhin. That came out today. Assuming that's true, he claimed that he was talking to Lukashenko, who's the president of Belarus. Now, if that's in fact true and Putin talked to him, then the whole thing ended very quickly. And the argument for ending it, according to Prigozhin, was we don't want to shed any Russian blood. So then the question is, why did you do it? And one of the key reasons, I think, that there are two possibilities. One is, I think Prigozhin was speaking for a lot of people who were very dissatisfied with Gerasimov and Shoigu because they feel strongly that this Ukrainian war should be brought to a close. Let's stop it. The only way to stop it is to advance, to attack, and crush the enemy. And their view is that there's so little left now on the Ukrainian side. Why are we waiting? Let's get this done. The longer we wait, the greater the possibility that NATO and its friends will find an excuse to intervene, and we don't want that to happen. Putin's taken the position, well, I'm holding back just in case NATO intervenes. In other words, I've got hundreds of thousands of troops. I've got a huge strategic reserve. If they're dumb enough to intervene, then I've got that, on hand that I can employ. That's a debate that is unfolding. We're hearing about a shakeup in the Russian high command. You'll recall that Putin had a meeting with some journalists, a small group of them, and he talked to them for 3 hours, something you never hear anybody in the United States do, any politician, that is. And he was very straightforward and frank. We have the transcripts, and one of the things that came up was a discussion about the senior leadership. And one of the journalists said, we're concerned because we're getting feedback from a lot of soldiers that we can do better, that we need more aggressive, more capable leaders. And he said, I think there's something to that, and I've got to look into it. I've got to look at it. I think we're going to see a shakeup in the high command. Now, there's an unsubstantiated rumor out there that the commander-in-chief of Russian airborne forces is now taking over the theater. I don't know. Haven't seen it confirmed anywhere. That could be the case. Also, in the same report, Gerasimov is returning to his essential duties as chief of the general staff. He's no longer going to run anything in connection with the war in Ukraine. Shoigu seems to be Shoigu. He's Putin's friend. I don't think Putin holds him, because he's a civilian. He's not a professional soldier, directly responsible for anything that's not right. So I think we'll see some shakeup in the high command, and that may foreshadow some offensive action. Now, here's another theory, that this was a carefully constructed show for the West to convince everybody that Russia was falling apart and see who said what and so forth. I don't buy that.
Yeah, I don't either.
I buy the first argument.
Yeah.
And people say, well, my gosh, how could this happen? George Marshall relieved 32 Corps and Division commanders during less than 3 years of fighting during World War II. Large numbers of senior officers were removed and changed and moved around and given new commands. This is not unusual in war. It happens. If it doesn't happen, you're in a lot of trouble. I mean, one of the complaints that I've had about the U.S. military and the Army in particular is no change. Why no change? Well, it's a stagnant pool of people and talent. You need fresh blood, fresh eyes, and I'm sure that Putin has discovered that's required in the Russian military, and I think we'll see it. Beyond that, I can't speculate anymore because I don't know, and I haven't talked to anybody who does.
The whole thing about, look, if we keep going the way we're going, this NATO thing's going to get done with Ukraine, and they're going to become a member. We got to kind of slow our roll the way we're going. Look, whether they go hard or go soft, what do you think are the chances that Ukraine's eventually going to be part of NATO?
Non-existent.
Non-existent?
Yes.
That's not going to happen.
No. And this is the problem. We don't seem to understand that if we continue to insist that whatever remains of Ukraine become part of NATO, we're going to see hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on the Polish border. They're just going to roll right across Ukraine. It will not stop until they hit the Polish border and the Romanian border. That's very clear. That's not what he wants. And I keep trying to explain this to people. If you know anything about Western Ukraine, I grew up with people from Western Ukraine. They do not want anything to do with the Russians. And Putin knows that. He doesn't want to run the place, doesn't want to govern it. He just doesn't want it to be a platform for attack against Russia, which is what we tried to turn it into. I also think the majority of Ukrainians that are still there, and maybe even the majority that are away, they may not like Russians, but I don't think they support this war. And the reason I say that is that if you go back to the election that brought Zelensky to power, when he was picked up from nowhere as a comedian and sponsored by Kolomoisky, who's a very powerful oligarch in Ukraine, he ran on a peace platform. He said, if I'm elected, I'll make peace with Russia. Well, virtually everybody, something like 89%, went out and voted for it. They wanted peace with Russia. There were only a very few people in the far west of Ukraine that didn't support that. So I don't think Zelensky is by any stretch of the imagination as widely supported as people think. And, you talk about their situation right now. He has press gangs. Press gangs are groups of people that go out and forcibly drag Ukrainians into the Ukrainian military because they need manpower. He's now doing that in the far western portions of Ukraine where he said he wouldn't do it, in Galicia and in the Carpathian, what used to be called the Carpathian Military District. Ukrainians are leaving. Ukrainians are moving out. There are reports now that Ukrainians are actually stoning and in some cases shooting at these press gangs from the Ukrainian army in western Ukraine, that they don't want to go to war. They don't want to fight. We're getting reports that platoon and company-size elements down in southern Ukraine are defecting. They're simply saying, look, we've had it. We can't do this anymore, and they're coming across and surrendering. And very, very smartly, the Russians from the beginning have treated all of the Ukrainian prisoners very, very well. They have not harmed them. They have not abused them or brutalized them. They facilitated prisoner exchanges, whereas we've got videotape of Ukrainian soldiers kneecapping with AK-47s, Russian knees of soldiers that are in captivity. We have video of them executing because the Ukrainian soldiers that did it actually posted it on YouTube, on the internet. So he's run a very good campaign in the sense that he's made it very clear, we don't want to kill you. We're not really the enemy. We want this to end too. And it has had an effect inside Ukraine that we are not hearing about. These things are not reported to us in the Western media because it undermines the narrative.
Did you see the Wall Street Journal story about a few days ago of Wagner mutiny revives U.S. fears over control of Russia's nuclear weapons? The Wagner paramilitary group failed insurrection in Russia led by Yevgeny has reignited concerns over control of Russia's nuclear arsenal. As U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken put it, anytime you have a major country like Russia that has signs of instability, that's something of concern. Despite these tensions, U.S. officials stated that they detected no irregular activities or changes in alert levels related to Russia's nuclear forces. Is that a real threat, or is that just a, story to exaggerate what's really going on to put fear in the American people?
Absolutely.
Second one.
Yes, absolutely. You're not hearing anything truthful from this administration. And the media is conspiring with the administration to misinform the public. It's simple truth. The same thing's happening in Western Europe. Nobody is being told the truth. The only way to get the truth is to talk to people who are over there on the ground. Fortunately, I have some people who are willing to do that and pass me information. And we forget that there are people in Poland that have grandparents who are Ukrainians living in eastern Ukraine. We forget that there are people who are Slovakian, some are Czech, who actually have brothers-in-law or cousins working in banks in Moscow. In other words, there are people over there that are telling the truth.
Yeah.
I just don't think we're getting it, and I don't see any evidence that that's going to change anytime soon. And that worries me because if we continue to push this false narrative and we make it abundantly clear that there will be no negotiation, which is what we're effectively saying. Right now, Putin has the following choice. You can pull all your forces out of Ukraine. You can prepare to commit suicide in public and remove yourself from office, and then we'll talk. I mean, that's absurd. There's no chance of any of that happening. So where are we headed? I think we're headed to lots of Russian troops on the Polish border unless someone wakes up in Europe. And I think it could happen in Germany and it could happen in France, where those governments are very fragile right now. I think Scholz's approval rating is about 32 or 33%. If they get rid of him and you get a new coalition involving the Alternative for Germany and maybe even the left, on the far left, those two groups are all opposed to this war. And there is no support in the German population for going to war with Russia. If you ask anybody in Germany, are you prepared to suit up and go to the Eastern Front? Everybody says, are you out of your mind? Of course not. If that were to happen, then Putin would have someone he could talk to in Berlin. And Berlin then could conceivably lead us out of this dead-end road. But that hasn't happened yet. And again, I think that's something else that Putin is watching for. I think that's another reason why he's held back.
Hadn't Russia and Germany grown close over energy deals and pipelines? And there was this, wasn't there a story narrative that they, thanks to the Russians turning off the pipeline as part of the Ukraine conflict, these poor Germans are going to be freezing in the winter. And so aren't they fairly, in recent times, fairly dependent on Russia and probably, in a position where it might not be a bad idea to be the moderating voice?
In 1914, Russia and Germany were each other's principal trading partners. In other words, when the war broke out, they were already each other's principal trading partners. Interestingly enough, the British were entirely dependent on the optics industry in Germany for all of its military applications.
Wow.
These things happen. Sometimes dumb ideas become policy without anybody consulting on the wisdom of doing something. In 1941, Russia and Germany were each other's principal trading partners. Germany could not have launched any offensive in the West in 1940 without copious amounts of steel and coal and iron and oil and gas and so forth from Russia. Impossible. Grain poured into Germany. In other words, this is a symbiotic relationship that's been there for a long time. This existed between Prussia and Russia, and the Prussians were always pro-Russian as a result and worked to avoid any conflict. This was Bismarck's argument. The Austrians were less open-minded, but they too sort of shut up and colored because they weren't in a position to do much. My point is, this is a natural relationship. It benefits both sides. We have looked at this and said this is evil and bad because this makes Germany dependent upon Russia. But we forget that Russia was also dependent upon Germany. And what happened in 1941 in July that changed everything? It's called Lend-Lease from the United States. We compensated Russia with everything that it had formerly been receiving from Germany: technology, steel, locomotives, you name it, all the resources, aluminum, all the precious metals, everything that the communists in Moscow needed to survive the German assault, we started providing immediately in July 1941, and we were not even part of the war. It was illegal, and FDR did that. Now, I'm not here to debate the wisdom of that. That's another subject, but my point is Russia also is dependent on Germany, just as Germany has been dependent on Russia. So the notion that it's a one-way street is just inaccurate and wrong.
So, Colonel, best case, worst case scenario here. Okay, best case, obviously we know what the best case is. Okay, they figured out it's done. You know, there's a way to coexist and everything goes smoothly. How bad is the worst case? This question's been asked. Many people have gone to different places. Give different elements of worst case.
Here's the thing that concerns me most of all, that could lead to the quote-unquote worst case, which I regard as a nuclear exchange, all right? No one in Russia, Putin, no one in Beijing, neither government has an interest in launching a nuclear weapon. I mean, they understand that if you use a nuclear weapon, the rapidity with which war will escalate is mind-numbing. That's the great myth of the so-called tactical nuclear weapon that you hear from the U.S. Air Force and others and the Navy. Oh, well, we can shoot a nuke, a low yield, only 5 kilotons, only kill maybe 30 or 40,000 people. No one will notice. In other words, this is a useful battlefield weapon. Outrageous nonsense. It is not. If any nuclear weapon is used, everybody escalates. And the reason for that is simple. Everyone's afraid that if they don't use their arsenal, they'll lose it. So we don't want to get there. How do we get there if we're stupid? If we're stupid and we try to engage the Russians conventionally, we'll lose. If there's one thing the Russians can handle, it's conventional warfare. You've already seen that in Ukraine. They can defeat us conventionally. We don't have enough forces to send. We don't have enough troops on active duty. If we try to suddenly mobilize and send someone across the Atlantic, we're going to encounter a huge Russian submarine fleet, which will sink everything that tries to cross the Atlantic. We will have no support out of anyone in Northeast Asia. The Koreans, the Japanese, nobody wants to be part of this war. So if you think you're going to have a backdoor into Russia across the Pacific, you've lost your mind. So if we engage them in conventional terms, we will lose. And we don't want to do that. In other words, let's not push that envelope. But that means that you have to recognize two things. First of all, in Europe, these borders have changed dozens of times over 1,000 years. Everybody looks at this border that constitutes the current Ukrainian construct and says, oh, well, that can never change. It's absurd. It never made any sense when Lenin created it because the Ukrainians lived primarily west of the Dnieper and a little bit to the east to the very northern edge of White Russia. That's it. And this thing called Ukraina, which means on the edge or the margin or something, had been ruled by the Duchy of Lithuania, then the Kingdom of Poland, then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for hundreds of years. And ownership passed back and forth with Russia because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fell apart largely on its own. My point is that we are imputing a degree of legitimacy to these borders that was never there. And that was Putin's speech that he gave months ago, long before the war, saying, look, these borders don't make any sense because you've got all these Russians in the east. Brzezinski, when he was alive, pointed to that and said, that's dangerous. We need to sit down and talk with the Russians and fix this problem because otherwise the presence of all of these Russians in eastern Ukraine is going to end up being a catalyst for war. Now, we thought we could get the Ukrainians to maintain a quote-unquote multinational, multicultural state where these people would be accepted and could live as co-equals.
This is the Minsk Accords that you said.
Yes,
Later,
yeah.
people said, no, we were lying.
Yeah, but the truth is, in Europe, how well have multinational, multilingual, multicultural states worked? Well, not so good. You know, the Soviet Union fell apart instantly, and what do you have now? Multiple nations. Yugoslavia fell apart very rapidly. You have multiple nations. Czechoslovakia fell apart instantly because Czechs and Slovaks didn't want to live together. This is the history of Europe. And historically, great powers have come to terms with each other and said, look, let's come up with this compromise. It may not be perfect. We may have to revisit this in 20 years, but let's get peace. In other words, let's establish peace first. Then we can come back and revisit it in the future as necessary to ensure everybody's interests are met. We won't do that. We have built ourselves up into this foolish notion that we're the indispensable superpower. We must dominate everything. Nothing on this planet can happen without us. Wrong. This planet went on for thousands of years before we showed up. You know, we can go anywhere you want with the Armenians, with the Turks. Talk about Azerbaijan. I was talking to somebody and I said, you realize these are Azeri Turks. And this was a member of Congress said, what's that? I mean, Americans don't know anything that happens beyond their borders, frankly. We don't study it. And the people that are governing us aren't paying attention to it. Right now, you try to explain Ukraine and they don't understand what that is, what it really means. It's history. If they understood any of it, we wouldn't be involved in it. We're not competent to sort this out. The Europeans need to sort it out.
Why, though? Unpack that. So if we did know the history, we wouldn't be involved in it. Why wouldn't we be involved in it?
Because there's been so much hatred and bloodshed in that part of the world over the last 100 years that it's virtually impossible for us to go in and reconcile all of these parties. In other words, to some extent, it has to be fought out. And I think that's already largely happened. And if we were smart, we would sit down and recognize that this has happened and say enough is enough. How much more blood has to be spilled? I don't think we need to spill any more blood in that region. And we need to redraw the borders. We need to make Western Ukraine, whatever remains of it, neutral.
You remember the whole 2 days before 9/11, Rumsfeld comes out saying $2.3 trillion of money's been missing. And, you know, that whole story of what happened and then 9/11 took place. And, hey, you know, weapons of mass destruction. We have to do all of that. That led to there was no weapons of mass destruction. And that one video where President Bush says, well, you know, with what's going on right now and they're, you know, trying to take over Iraq, he says, oops, you know, similar thing. I don't know if you've seen when he's giving that speech. So a lot of people are sitting there saying, okay, so who wants this thing to continue? Eisenhower prepped everybody right after he was done saying, be careful with the whole military industrial complex. JFK was kind of pushing the envelope saying, hey, we got to also go through this. Trump was also saying there's no need to go into half these wars. Why do we have 780 military bases? But who wants this thing to continue and who benefits the most if this thing continues?
Well, remember that the bases that you're referring to are really a product of the Cold War. And the fact that after the Second World War ended, we were literally the only man standing. Europe was in ruins. The Soviet Union was by no means strong enough to wage a new war. They'd lost, we think now they've lost during the war 39 million. So we were the only power. Japan was prostrate. We had to stay in Japan because if we had left Japan, it could have become a Soviet satellite. In other words, most of the things that we did after 1945 have to do with communism, containing it, suppressing it. And remember, the idea was that you don't confront directly militarily. You contain it until it finally implodes. Guess what? It worked. They imploded. We like to say, well, we caused it, but the truth is the system itself was so dysfunctional, it was going to implode on its own.
Totally
anyway.
get it. Yeah.
So then this ends, and then you have a lot of people in Washington say, well, we hold all the cards. We're the only superpower. In other words, we're the British Empire after Waterloo. You know, we can intervene everywhere. We can reshape the world in our own image. You have this man, Wolfowitz, who wrote a document in the Pentagon that essentially says, we're going to become altruistic imperialists. We're going to go over there, right the wrongs, make the world safe for us, make it safe for our allies, make it safe for Israel, whatever, you know, go down the list. This was Wolfowitz. Everybody adopted this and said, this is great because there's no one who can challenge us. Remember Desert Storm? Desert Storm sent this message. Look, we've got things nobody else has. Nobody can take us on. Well, the truth is that everything that we had in Desert Storm as a monopoly has been lost. And all the technologies and capabilities that we had then that no one else did are now everywhere. Everybody's got them. And you can see that happening right now in Ukraine. So the world has changed, but we did not. We decided, well, you know, we're going to run this place, and we're going to structure the financial system, the global financial system, to suit us. We're going to use it to force people to do the things we want them to do. And we're doing it all in the name of this crusading liberal democratic approach. In other words, we're crusaders for liberal democracy. Well, that doesn't hold up to close scrutiny. I mean, let's face it, that's a lot of nonsense. Behind the scenes, you have all of these people invested in personally and in terms of their wealth invested in this global structure. We call it security, and the rest of the world looks at it as potentially dangerous American military presence. I don't know that Americans realize that this hangover from the Cold War is primarily responsible for it. But if you have lots of money going into weapon systems, into programs, into policies, into foreign aid that have been going there and going there and going there and going there, you have lots of people on the Hill, and you have lots of donors who control the Hill that profit from that. They don't want that to stop. And that was Trump's great sin, if you will, in Washington. He's disrupting the money flow. If Trump gets away with this, we're going to go broke. We'll lose money. That was the reason Trump was hated, despised, and successfully subverted, I would add. But we still have to do it. We still have to stop it. And we're up against a group of people in Washington who want to keep it going. Now, when does this end? When, you know, what did Ben Stein said? It goes on until it can't. And, you know, we can debate about the true structure of the economy, the underlying fundamentals, which I don't think are particularly good. I'm there with Ricards and others who think we're headed for serious trouble. But there are lots of people who say, oh, no, we can print money in perpetuity and do whatever we want. I think it's going to end. When it ends, what happens historically is the empire, the overseas possessions, vanish. Troops come home, the investments end, and you start over from scratch. And I think that's where we're headed.
When it ends, will Putin still be the leader of Russia?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Oh,
Okay,
remember,
so-
he's dying of terminal cancer, remember?
Right.
He was supposed to be dead at least a year or two ago.
Right.
But, yeah, he'll probably be around, yeah.
So what you're saying is, if you're saying when it ends, he's still going to be the leader of Russia, you're saying it's going to end pretty soon. It's not going to be ending anytime.
You know, I don't know. The black swan concept. I think there's a pond out there with lots of black swans swimming around. When will one of them take off? You know, if I knew that, I'd be a billionaire. I'd be as rich as you.
Does BlackRock want it to continue? Does BlackRock want it to keep going?
Well, I think BlackRock wants to control as much of Ukraine as it can. Monsanto and a number of other firms are all in there because you're talking about some of the richest agricultural land in the world. You know, about 15, 20 feet of black earth. I mean, it was so rich that during the war, Hitler tried to load boxcars with it and bring it back to Germany. That's how valuable it is. I've had Russians and Ukrainians tell me, you know, stick anything you want in the ground, it'll grow something. It's that good. So I'm sure that there are lots of people who would like to get at lots of people would like to get at Russia's resources. I mean, there's always that aspect in any war. But will this work? I don't know. I mean, I feel badly personally for the Ukrainians because they're the victims in all of this.